Well, welcome back to the Dairy Signal. On behalf of the professional dairy producers, it's a great day for education, information, and communications. As we hop right into it, today's topic is going to be cows, robots, and motivating that voluntary milking. So we're not going and fetching cows. And to lead us through that, and certainly to walk us through our own voluntary learning, is Dr. Trevor DeVries from University of Guelph. Before we do that, if you are new to the Dairy Signal or have been a follower over the last 5 years of the Dairy Signal, you know that we have a new format. For those of you that are just tuning in today, I want to make sure that you understand the walkabout how things are going to work. Because the Dairy Signal is not only for you to passively learn by listening in, and it will be recorded so that you can pick it up on the Professional Dairy Producers website and library, but also you can ask questions. If you go to the lower right-hand corner of your screen, there's three little dots. You press on those. There'll be a pop-up screen that allows you to put some of your contact information that you choose to put in there, type in your question, and hit ask the question. And that will come to our screen. And then at the end or during the presentation, we will ask Dr. DeVries those questions. So this is the way that you can be very interactive and drive the content of today's program. A little bit about professional dairy producers. We're a dairy producer led and run organization. I work for 9 of the most brilliant dairy farmers in the US. They are very involved with professional dairy producers and they lead the direction of this organization, whose mission is to share ideas, resources, solutions, and experiences that help the dairy sector succeed. A little bit about today's partner and sponsor of the Dairy Signal. It is DMI, Dairy Management Inc. That is our national checkoff program that helps promote not only to ensure confidence of our product, dairy, the brand dairy and milk, but also to help partner with the sales of those products that we are so fond of from our cows. So we thank DMI for not only their leadership, but their partner. It's our checkoff program that connects all of us from coast to coast. So thanks for DMI for making today's Dairy Signal possible. A couple other reminders. Today's program, you're eligible for those of you who collect continuing education credits, which are important. We're a sector that does a lot of continuing education, have from the very beginning, from the first cow that walked in America and around the globe. We're always constantly learning about better ways to take care of her, our environment around us, produce a better product, and obviously be more in tune to what our consumers need. DACE is one of those ways to take credit for the educational improvement that you're doing. It's Dairy Advance. Make sure that you listen in and you just can get your credits by taking a short quiz at the completion of today's program. Another program that I want to make all of our producers aware of. We hear a lot about carbon and carbon sequestration and lowering our carbon emissions, but who the heck knows where they're at right now on their farm? The best way to know that number is to go to Your Farm, Your Footprint, which you can get more information about that on the Professional Dairy Producers site. You're the only one that will get that information back. So if you're a little bit curious about that, you can call Professional Dairy Producers. We'll lead you through that. And we have dollars from Dairies Foundation in a partnership with the food system that can help offset your costs of discovering just your numbers and not having to share them. All right, we're ready to hop into what motivates voluntary milking with Dr. Trevor DeVries. And Dr. DeVries holds a PhD as a professor and with a Canadian research. He's the chair of that council at the Department of Animal Biosciences at the University of Guelph. And I will tell you, one of our more sought after and favorite cow presenters that we have at Professional Dairy Producers. Dr. DeVries, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and then let's hop right into a great presentation.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Shelley, for the introduction, and thanks to the professional dairy producers for the invite. It's always a pleasure to be part of the Dairy Signal and other programming put on by PDP. Had the pleasure of actually speaking on this topic at the business meeting this past spring, and thought it would be great to be able to share some of that information here. Yeah, as introduced, I'm a professor with the University of Guelph. I've been here for close to 20 years at the university, focusing largely on ways to improve the nutrition, the management, housing of cattle through deeper understanding of the behavior and physiology of dairy cows. And a large proportion of that research over the last number of years has been on robotic milking, which we've seen dramatic increases in adoption within Canada. For 10, 15 years, we've seen more and more in the United States in the last number of years as well. And there's always new things to learn, and we're continuing to make progress, whether it's housing management, whether it's the milking management itself, whether it's nutritional management. And today, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about just simply motivating voluntary milking in these systems as kind of a keystone to success in those systems.
That's awesome. It's amazing how the dairy industry continues to evolve and the data that we can collect about our cows and information that we can get to better serve their needs. And seems like robotics are a great way to move, especially when we start talking about the lifestyle of the cow as well as the betterment of the business. So we're eager to figure out how we can motivate these cows to do their jobs so that we can work more harmoniously with them. So tell us what you know.
Yeah, no, and one of the one of the things that I always like to kind of remind people of, and you alluded to that, Shelley, is the fact that we have a lot of opportunities with automated or robotic milking opportunity, and a lot of that has to do with the producers themselves, herd owners, managers, from a labor efficiency standpoint, from a lifestyle standpoint, especially for those kind of owner-operator type farms. And again, we've documented that over the years. And then also from a cow perspective, we know that there's benefits from having more autonomy, say, for example, over their behavioral patterns. And part of that autonomy then is to encourage voluntary milking. And that's really kind of the crux of what I wanted to chat about today, is the fact that for success in these systems, we want cows to be going to milk voluntarily. And it sounds a bit funny to say that because we talk about it being a voluntary milking system, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that in every situation those cows will do that. But if they do that, that's how we get basically efficiency from a labor standpoint in terms of minimizing how much work we're putting into the systems, the efficiency of the equipment. We recognize that robots are a large capital cost on any farm, and so we want to optimize the use of that technology that we're purchasing. And then from a cow perspective, the more we can do that, the obviously the more frequent we can get cows to milk, especially at particularly at different times of lactation, we're going to gain the best health and performance from those cows. And that kind of goes to my second point there is, again, making sure that we do best for that cow through her entire lactation in terms of getting good production, good efficiency, and good health. And there's obviously other factors at play there, but part of that is related to just making sure that those cows go and milk voluntarily. Now, that's all good to say, but the reality is that we see a lot of variation in how that's actually achieved within the industry. And I highlight just some numbers that came out of a recent paper we published last year on a fairly large sample of dairy farms, over 100 farms. You can see here the N there, up to 154 farms, and for some of these metrics that we were able to capture over a long period of time where we were able to gather robot information, for example. And if we just highlight the top row there, which is the average milking frequency on these farms, the average is 2.8. So we're getting close to that 3 milkings per day, which I think a lot of robot producers would like to be at. And so that sounds good and all as far as an average, but averages are averages and they don't always tell us the full story. And if we look at the variation, in this case, the standard deviation, that means that, yeah, farms range from anywhere about 66%, 67% of farms were between, right, 2.4 and 3.2 milkings per day. And the actual full range was between 1.8 and 3.8. And so that means that, yeah, there's some farms doing really well, almost up to 4 milkings per day. And you might even question whether or not we need that many milkings. But then on the other side, there's some farms that weren't even in this case. There's one farm here at an average of 1.8 milkings, which isn't even a 2x equivalent. And so obviously that's not what we want to be achieving when it comes to robotic milking. And so what's nice about this data and other is that, yeah, that variation also then allows us to explore what might be causing or relating to some of that variability in terms of, yeah, how often cows are actually milking and the factors then that kind of relate to that voluntary milking nature on those farms. And so that kind of then begs the question, or at least brings up the question for us. And I'm going to ask kind of my own questions, I think, throughout this session here is what actually motivates a cow to milk in a robot? And I think when I ask that question, and for those that are listening here or watching, probably the first thing that might come to mind is feed that we provide in the robot. And I don't disagree. That comes to my mind still, and definitely is a factor. But it's also, and that's something I'll come back to later on here, is that it's also the feed in the feed bunk. And we know that both of those things, the feed that we provide in the robot can act as an enticer. We can also change the amount of that feed to meet the needs of the cows to some degree. And so there's some opportunity there. We won't get into that here today as so much, but we know that both that feed there, but also the feeding behavior at the bunk is going to influence that cow. But then, and with anything in dairy farming, which we always have to remember is that the cow is at the center, and I put her here, right? I put her at the middle, and you've probably heard before the phrase "the cows don't lie," right? And we need to think about that cow because it's really her at the end of the day that makes that decision to go. And yes, it's the feed that's influencing her, but then there's going to be other things related to that cow that are going to have an impact there, probably even before we think about the feed. And that's a few of the things that I wanted to kind of go through with you here today is the fact that it's likely accumulation of different things, the health of the cow being very important, right? And I think we know that from any situation, if cows aren't in optimal health, they're not going to perform the way that we want them to. There's behavior and experience, so behavioral differences between animals and experience differences, which are going to relate to that outcome. And then the feed is there as well, and we'll talk about that as well. So just kind of going through these kind of three different areas, starting with the health of the cows. And again, various different aspects of health that play a role, particularly in voluntary milking. Probably the biggest one would be the hoof health of the cows. And again, I show a picture of a cow walking here with or a video of a cow walking with a limp. Again, not a cow that we want to see. We don't want to see lameness in our cows. But the reality is that we do have lame cows, and again, we know there's risk factors for that. We know it can still be a challenge for some farms. The reality is that for a robotic milking herd, that becomes even that much more of a challenge because these cows that are walking with some kind of limp or gait impairment, they're doing that because they have pain and likely a pain in their hoof or some kind of pain in their leg or joints. And that results in a cow that doesn't want to, say, walk as freely and won't want to walk to a robot as freely. And the data is pretty clear on that. We did a fairly significant study already almost 10 years ago showing dramatic differences in terms of milking behavior between cows that are what we call sound, that walk very well, versus those that have gait impairment or we could classify as lame. Or in this case, actually, most of these cows were what we would kind of consider mildly lame. The severely lame cows tend to be, for interest's sake, actually addressed very quickly in robot herds. And I think because they're even that much more painfully obvious, so to speak, because those cows just do not go milk voluntarily. But even the cows that I would kind of classify as more mildly lame or moderately lame, those cows are also requiring much more fetches to that milking robot. And in the case of this study we did, a large sample of herds and cows across these herds, they were about 2.2 times more likely to be fetched for milking because they weren't, yeah, voluntarily going. And as a result of that, we see a lower milking frequency or voluntary milking on those cows. And in the case of the study, that was about a difference of zero point 0.3 milkings per day, which again, in this case, was a difference between about 3.1 and 2.8 milkings per day, which again, if you look at the numbers, is like, okay, that's not so bad. But when that translates into differences in production, that starts to get our attention a little bit more. And in the case of this study, that was about a 1.6 kilogram difference in milk production or 3.5 pound difference in milk yield between those groups of cows. And again, these mildly lame cows might not, right, be that obvious in all circumstances, except for the fact that, yeah, they are a little bit less likely to milk voluntarily and are going to be more at risk of yeah, not eating as much, not milking as frequently, and producing less milk. And even though we've made a lot of progress over the years on lameness front, and we still recognize it as a challenge in our industry. And we followed this same study up actually a few years later, a little bit from a fairly large sample of robot farms, 75 farms in Ontario, Canada, where we found that when we gait scored cows and lameness scored them on a scale of 1 to 5, the cows that were scoring 3 and higher, on average across farms was 28%. And so that's still a fairly significant number. Now that does range, right? So our lowest herds here were 10%, but we even had a herd up to basically 2/3 of their cows. Now, again, I think most of us recognize that that's completely unacceptable and that there's significant challenges associated with that. But even within the, let's say a little bit of a lower range, every 5 percentage points was associated with about 2.2 pounds less milk. And so even if I from a range of say 10 to 40%, that's a 30 percentage point range. If I divide that by five, that's six multiplied by 2.2 is about 13, 14 pounds. So that's a 13 to 14 pound difference in milk production per day per cow, just based on the lameness prevalence on these herds, right? And so all the other things that we've studied relationship to robotic milking, whether it's housing design, cow comfort, nutritional differences, none of those things explain that much variability in production. And so simply, right, making sure our cows are as healthy as they can be, getting and what that means from a lameness perspective, particularly, and I think most people have heard this, but it's good to reiterate, is yeah, it comes back to making sure those cows are comfortable, the floors are comfortable, stalls are comfortable, they're clean, they're dry, all those good things, right? Cows have sufficient space, right? Stocking densities aren't too high because all those things are going to be potential contributors to that risk. Now, again, once we've got kind of the health of the cows in check, so to speak, we need to think about, okay, well, what about the cow, just her behavior and her experience? And this is really interesting because this is something that we've probably more recently been looking at in terms of a lot of the data we look at, we see a lot of variability between herds, between cows, even within herds, in terms of how they're performing. And it probably shouldn't surprise us because we realize that these cows are, again, they're animals. We expect them to kind of perform as a herd, but even within a herd, they're individuals and they have individual kind of behavioral profiles and the way that those animals behave, even though genetically they could be very similar, we see differences in terms of the behavior of those cows. And one of the ways that we've actually been looking at this is to classify the behavior of the cow in terms of what we would say the personality of the cow is. And I think I did a PDP dairy signal session last year on behavioral individuality or personality of cows. And I might have even presented some of the same data where we demonstrated it again in a previous robot study that we see pretty good associations between the milking behavior patterns of cows and robots and their personality types. And in this case, this is an example of cows. All these dots are individual cows, where on the x-axis here we have a scale of activeness, basically, of the cows. And basically, if we go from left to right, those are more active cows. And in this case here, the activeness of the cows or the activity level of the cows correlates with the mean milking frequency of these cows in a robotic milking unit. Now, again, not a perfect relationship, but again, we see this positive slope where those more active cows have more milkings. And we've seen this with other behavioral traits as well, things like the boldness of the cows or the explorative nature of the cows being associated with milking in cows and robots. And on the flip side, when we've got cows that are, say, more fearful, for example, those cows show the opposite behavior. They might be less likely to go in the robot, or they might be a bit more skittish when they're in the robot. And so all these kind of behavioral differences of these cows can have an influence on their performance in these robotic milking units. And again, we've spent quite a bit of time actually in a number of studies over the last couple of years too, then trying to explore where some of this kind of personality or individuality and behavioral differences comes from and how we can influence that. And it's kind of interesting because not only my research group, but a number of others have been looking into this. So things like early life experience. We know that the way that we maybe manage calves and heifers might have, yeah, long-term impacts on their behavioral profiles. Some of the research on socialization of calves early on in life, pairing calves or group housing calves, we know that can have both possibly. And so some have made the suggestion too that early exposure to automation may improve that later adaptation. And there's some research kind of ongoing to look at that. There's definitely a genetic component to this. If you've ever milked cows and you know you've got a dam in the herd and you've got a daughter, and often those, right, those two have very similar kind of behavior, especially when they're not the most well-behaved cows. You'll sometimes say, oh yeah, she's a daughter of so and so, and she wasn't a nice cow either, right? And I'm sure Shelley's laughing because I'm sure she's seen that before in her life as well. And so again, we've got some data to suggest that, yeah, these behavioral traits, just like temperament, are passed down from mother to daughter as well.
Do you see any differences in just overall breed characteristics, like the difference between Jerseys, Holsteins, and Swiss on
Oh,
adaptability?
yeah, for sure. And that's a really interesting one and something that we haven't I've seen it more anecdotally. I haven't got like research data to kind of pinpoint that, but we definitely see differences in behavioral profiles of the different breeds. For example, a Jersey herd, inherently the Jerseys tend to be more curious, right? They tend to be a little more active. And so, yeah, they tend to be in many cases, and there's going to be someone who's going to try to argue me on this, but most cases they tend to be a little easier to train to the robots. Sometimes they're actually almost have to be discouraged from using the robots because they're just circling through because they are that curious. And so I think there's some yeah, definitely some differences there that we can take advantage of as well. And that kind of ties in, I guess, and I just said that word training, and that's kind of the next thing I wanted to mention is that we haven't really to date focused enough on that because we know in many cases that yeah, animals need exposure and previous experience and training to different situations, but how active we are in some of that training can probably have a pretty big impact in terms of how these cows do in these robotic milking systems. And what's kind of interesting is that we did a study again a number of years ago in collaboration with some other Canadian researchers where we surveyed 200 robot milking producers. And what we found in the case of that survey was that many producers were actually very hesitant to train their cows. And some of that was just related the time associated with that. Producers say, "Hey, I moved to robots to get away from adding labor. Why do I need to be right doing additional things that are going to cost me more labor time?" Now, we broke that in the case of that study. We broke it down a little bit. We looked at the proportion of herds that were training their cows, both their heifers as well as cows that were they were adapting, say, who had never been on the robot before, and then also what elements that they were incorporating in that training. And across different brands, it was fairly consistent, and in terms of the amount of training that was being done, between about 40 to 50% of producers were training, which meant that 50 to 60% of producers were not training. And then within that was kind of interesting because the vast majority of those that were training their cows said that they were providing feed, so like a positive reward to the cows. Um, Whereas lesser so, only right around 30 to 50% of producers were doing things like spraying the teats or using other kind of mechanical features of the robot to get those cows accustomed to the use of the robot, which again might be viewed by the cows at least as kind of more negative aspects of the milking system, as opposed to say getting a feed reward within that robot. And that's kind of interesting too, because at the same time, there's been some researchers that would suggested that training should not include kind of those negative aspects like the noise and mechanics of the robot. Um, and then others noting that yeah, the response was quite variable, and so some of that's led to some hesitancy in terms of that training. And so we've actually followed this up with a couple recent studies on this to look at this. And the first study we did, we actually took heifers that were in lactation. We didn't want to have the stress of calving kind of also at play here, but we wanted to look at what elements of training were most important for kind of conditioning those cows to the robotic milking unit. And so we had actually three treatments and a control where there was no training. One of the treatments was the cows just got exposed to the robot and the environment. And another one, they got exposed to the environment plus a food reward, the pellet in the robot. And then the third kind of training treatment was exposure to the robot, but then only the mechanics, so the more negative kind of sights and sounds of the robot as opposed to the positive food reward. Now, this paper, which was published earlier this year in the Journal of Dairy Science, was quite interesting because at the end of the day, what we found was that the cows that were exposed to the mechanics of the robot during training, they were actually the hardest to train. And probably because we were introducing this kind of more negative aspect of the robot to the cows during training. But when we actually put them on the robot to get milked, those cows actually performed the best. And it was the cows that had the pellet, just the pellet, and not the exposure to the negative things. Those cows actually performed worse compared to our control cows in terms of the frequency of voluntary milkings and the need to be fetched to the robot. And so, what this kind of told us is that when we think about training, and we've probably seen this if you've ever trained a another animal, say a dog for something, or even sometimes when we think about the exposure of different things to our children, you probably need a balance, right? Of not just positive, but also, right, a little bit of the kind of the negative aspects of these things too. And so when we think about what's required in training, the cows, yes, a positive reward can be helpful, but an acclimation or an understanding of the, and I coin it negative here, but the things, yeah, that might be a little bit more novel or viewed by the cow as more negative also need to be part of that training regimen. And the balance of those two things is probably important. And so the take home is that yeah, we probably need both of those. And so then we actually followed that up with a more recent study where we really combined all those factors. So that we took pre-fresh heifers at 2 weeks prior to their expected calving date, and we brought them to the robot for 4 days, 3 times a day, 2 weeks before calving, and we exposed them to not only the environment of the robot, but then also the mechanics and the pellets. So we had this balance of kind of the positive and negative aspects of that robot. And when we did that, we saw dramatic kind of responses from those cows, where those cows that had the training as compared to those cows with no training did that much better. When we looked at kind of their behavior, especially in their first few milkings, but then even over the 21 days after exposure, the cows that had training, they did much better. They had a better milk letdown. They had a much better kind of behavioral temperament in the robot. Their ease of entry, that's the EOE on the screen here. This score here is basically how easily those cows went in, and those cows did much better compared to the cows that were not trained. And as a result of that, we saw over, again, the first 21 days on that robot, much more voluntary visits to the robot and voluntary milkings in those cows, really suggesting that, yeah, we can have a very positive impact on these cows with that pre-training. And as a result of that, and this is probably where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, we saw an improvement in milk yield on those cows, almost a 5 pound difference in milk yield over the first 21 days in those cows, 5 pounds per day. And again, what's kind of interesting in this is, yes, there was a little bit of a difference in voluntary milking. We did have a minimum milking frequency, so numerically, yes, a little different, but statistically, the milking frequency was the same. The dry matter intake actually of these cows was very similar as well. And so suggesting that, again, potentially even just the stress and physiological reaction of those cows in those first 21 days having or reduced stress, I should say, having a positive impact on those cows and the ability of those cows to reach their production potential. And so kind of short take home from this work is that, yeah, we training those cows or some kind of pre-exposure of those cows to the system, both the positive aspects and the negative aspects of the system, very important for getting those cows accustomed to the milking system. One other point related to kind of individual, yeah, experience and motivation that I wanted to bring up, what a lot of people still have questions around, and I thought I'd be preemptive kind of in asking the question is, are cows actually motivated to go milk on their own? And are they motivated by udder pressure? And does that also get influenced by what's happening in the robot? And this is a question that I've been asked for a number of years. There's very little kind of data from research on this in terms of supporting this. Um, One of the previous studies that goes back over 20 years would suggest that there's fairly limited motivation of cows based on their internal kind of udder pressure to go milk. That research was done with fairly low producing cows relative to today's standards. And so we sought to kind of take another look at this in a more recent study. And the way that we looked at this was basically we took cows that were accustomed to using the robot, and we did basically two things to them. One is we extended the milking interval at which they're allowed to milk. So basically to try to artificially create some udder pressure in those cows. So basically they didn't have permission to go milk as quickly as they used to, and so that would require them to wait longer, build up a bit more udder pressure, and we wanted to see what impact that had on their milking behavior. And then vice versa, these cows were fed some feed in the robot as an enticement, and so we took that feed away and just to see again what happened to their milking behavior and see how those two things compare. And very interesting, and this is kind of the data from that study. The green bars are the baseline period. So this is before we change their milking or feeding settings in the robot. The blue bar is the middle one here is when we extended the milking interval. So we basically made those cows wait longer to be milked. And the reddish bar here on the right in each of these is the removal of the feed from the cows in the robot. And what you can see here is basically at the end of the day, both of these situations created a change in the cows relative to their baseline, where the cows who had their milking interval extended, they started visiting more often. And that's likely because those cows wanted to milk and they didn't have the permission to milk. And so they started visiting more often. They were ejected from the robot more often. So, yeah, fitting that hypothesis that, yeah, there probably is some internal motivation for those cows. Now, again, those cows are getting some feed in the robot or wood. So maybe that's also playing in there. Because on the flip side, when we took the feed away, the cows started coming less. And we didn't follow these cows long enough. We only did this over a limited number of days for practical reasons, but it would have been interesting to see how long those cows would have kept coming, or if maybe they would have stopped coming because of that enticement was gone from them in the robot. We don't know that. At the end of the day, we know that yeah, there's likely some enticement there that yeah was being kind of thwarted by our management here and it had an effect on the behavior of these cows.
So does that go hand in hand without making an assumption, udder pressure and stage of lactation, like stage of bloom?
Yeah, and there's it's not as probably like simple as that, right? Definitely we see cows in earlier lactation, right, that are building more udder pressure, have a bit more. We see more milking frequency. Often we kind of artificially um, enhance that, so to speak, through our milking settings, anyways, because we want probably those cows, especially in the first 30 days, 60 days, we want those cows milking frequently. That's good from a mammary cell proliferation standpoint. And we actually see going back to old studies where we changed milking frequency, for example, on fresh cows. And if we can get fresh cows to milk more often, we see higher peaks in persistency in cows. And so, now again, it's probably a cyclical thing that, right? And once we get the cows into that kind of rhythm too, that might also drive them to the robot a bit more too, right? So if we give them the permission to milk more frequently, right, then that's also going to help push their production and maybe push them more often to that robot, as opposed to the end of lactation where, yeah, we don't necessarily need as much milk and we don't necessarily want that cow milking 3 times a day or more often. It's probably better if she only milks twice a day at the later end of lactation. And so in that case there, then yeah, the motivation probably goes down with that as well. So again, it very good question. I think we probably need to set up some complicated studies to look at that. But in theory, yeah, basically what you're kind of proposing there, yeah, makes sense.
I just wondered if there was a physiological beyond udder pressure, like hormonal tendency or anything like that, that might be underlining that could drive the desire to be milked.
Yeah, well, and that's where it becomes complicated because there definitely are those hormonal drivers that are driving the production in the cow. But how much of that then translates over into actually changing the behavior of the cows, right? I'm not sure. It's likely more of a mediated effect by the actual production of the cow and yeah, what she's doing from a mammary standpoint for sure. Yeah. Um, Last thing I wanted to touch on, and that's where I kind of started, was the fact that, yeah, beyond the cow, her health, her experience, her training, her internal motivation, we know that there's other kind of exogenous things that we can use to stimulate that cow to milk. And feed is definitely one of them. Like I said, we provide feed in the robot to have that enticement to the cows. We also feed the cow in the robot to potentially supplement her nutritional requirements. But then it's also the feed in the bunk, and there's a lots of discussion around, right, how much do those things influence the behavior of the cows and her milking patterns. We took a look at this in a national study a couple years ago to try to understand how much dietary strategy and formulation impacts milking behavior. This is the same data I showed right off the top, where I summarized some of the milking frequency data. One of the things that we did in this study was we summarized all the ration and dietary information on a large sample of farms. And I throw up a table from the paper. I don't expect people to uh, go through these numbers. You can look at those numbers on your own time. But basically, what we did was we quantified the nutrient composition as well as the ingredient composition of diets of a large sample, over 150 robot farms in Canada, based on different regions in Canada, to look at the variability of those diets and how that not only was associated with production differences, which probably not too surprising, we didn't see a lot just because there's a lot of variation. But one of the things that we're particularly interested in is how those dietary variations, nutrient composition variations, also then associated with milking patterns in those herds. And probably the most interesting thing there was that there was really only one major dietary kind of nutritional content difference associated with milking frequency. And I have that listed here, and that's the average milking frequency, which was 2.8 times, which I said earlier in my presentation, was negatively associated with the amount of NFC or non-fiber carbohydrates in the PMR, so the feed in the bunk for those cows. And that would be, yeah, an indication of how much starch and energy is in that PMR. And so basically, if the NFC content was a little higher, we saw a little bit of a decrease in milking frequency on those herds. And I think that kind of fits with a lot of the thinking is that, yeah, we need to have a little bit of an energy differential. We want those cows driven a little bit to the robot. Doesn't have to be dramatic, and there's other research to suggest that. And even here, the actual estimate, so to speak, the impact on the number of milkings is really low. And so while it's significant, it's not biologically a huge kind of impact. What's probably more interesting is that what we saw as far as having larger impacts in terms of milking frequency on these farms were actually things related to housing and management. And so the farms with free traffic, as opposed to those using guided systems, on average, were milking much more often, so 0.62 more milkings per day. The difference, again, in our data set between our guided and our free traffic was generally basically a difference of 3 milkings per day for the free traffic farms or free flow farms versus 2.4 milkings per day for those guided traffic farms. And interestingly, the amount of feed push-ups on those farms were actually related to the milking frequency. And so more feed push-ups associated with more milking. And I wanted to point out here on the bottom here, every 1 milking per day was associated in this same data set with about 7.5 pounds more milk per day. And so, yeah, we definitely know that obviously milking frequency is very important and can and does impact, yeah, differences in production at that herd level. Some of you might question, well, how does yeah, feeding management relate to milking frequency? And the reality is that we know that regardless of the type of herd it is, whether or not it's a free traffic system, a guided traffic system in these robot herds, we know that milking times are linked to periods of feeding activity. In fact, the cows, just like other things, they time their behavior to different things. And so when cows go to the feed bunk, they're also more likely to probably go to the robot. And we see that in data that we have. This is already an old study, I would say. I know Shelley and I were talking about years and I'm saying old in terms of being 15 years old here, not in the grand scheme of things, but in the progression of how much growth we've seen in the industry and robots in the last number of years. This was probably one of the early on studies that at least I was involved with, where we see within day here variation in terms of when cows are milking. And what's kind of unique to this study is that the peaks in milking activity here that you see at different times of the day at the robot actually correspond to periods of feeding activity in these cows. So the cows were fed here in the red arrows, and then also their feed was pushed up in the green. And if I'm a robotic milking producer, I want to see this line as flat as possible because a flat line would mean basically the most efficient use of this system as possible. And to get that flat line, I need cows basically occupying the feed bunk 24 hours per day. Not every individual cow, but those cows really distributing their intake behavior across the herd, within the herd, so that, yeah, we're not only getting nice distribution of eating behavior across the herd across the day, but also milking behavior. And so then that begs the last question is, how do we stimulate cows to access their PMR? And again, lots of research on this. The number one thing there, it has to be an internally motivated thing. And so we want diets that encourage good eating behavior. I think I've talked about eating behavior of cows on the dairy signal before. The number one factor there has to be forage quality, right? And again, we're at a time of year where this is top of mind of a lot of producers, making sure that again we get those crops in at the right time. Yes, we want more yield, but often, again, put the quality ahead of the total yield on those on the harvest dates on those fields so that we can optimize the quality of those feeds and those forages, which is going to optimize the eating behavior of those cows and encourage quick returns to eating and more dry matter intake, more meals in cows. Very important from rumen perspective, from an intake perspective, but even in a robot herd from a milking perspective. And then beyond that, we can use feeding management, how often we feed the cows, how often we push up feed to stimulate those cows as well. And again, the delivery of feed can have an impact on stimulating intake. It can have an impact on the milking behavior. We know that translates into more consistent eating patterns in cows and more consistent rumen environments in cows. And this is a robot study from a couple of years ago where we showed the herds that fed more often, 3 times a day or more, had higher de novo fat in their milk, which is basically a reflection of the stability of the rumens of those cows, which would really reflect a kind of a more stable eating pattern on those cows. And again, that's what we really want to see. We want to see a more stable eating pattern that not only keeps the rumen healthy, but in these robot herds, then also keeps those cows flowing to the robot. And again, the other aspect that's important is that, yeah, when the cow gets up and goes, she's hungry, she goes to the feed bunk, we have feed available to her. And that's where the feed push-up becomes that much more important. Whether it's by hand, by a skid steer, or by an automated robot, doesn't matter how we do it as long as it gets done. That's my take home always. It has to get done, it has to get done consistently, and it has to be done frequently. And when we do that, we see the benefits. And those benefits are, again, even that much greater in these robot herds. And we saw that in a large study a few years ago, almost 200 farms involved in this study. The mean number of push-ups was over 12 times per day. So every 2 hours on average, feed was being pushed up. Within that, we saw variability, and every 5 extra feed pushes, we saw about 0.77 pounds more milk. And so again, it's a few pounds milk difference between herds that we're just predicting based on how often that feed's getting pushed up. And like I said before, that's important for every herd that's out there, not just the robot herds, but that's even that much more important in these robot herds. So that's a kind of a quick summary, so to speak, of why and how voluntary milking is important and how we stimulate that in these robot herds. Again, my take homes is really keeping cows healthy and comfortable. And again, these aren't really, you could say these aren't necessarily all even specific to robot herds, right? We want to do this in every situation, but again, amplified in these situations where we have cows that have to make that choice to go milk. We need them to move with their feet, so to speak. So we got to keep them healthy, keep them comfortable, make sure that we account for differences in themselves. And part of that is, yeah, being aware of early life experience, training being very important. And then lastly, there too, there is a good role of feeding of those cows, not just at the robot, but also at the bunk and keeping those cows motivated. So with that, yeah, thank you for your attention today. I'd like to thank my supporters and the people, both the dairy farmers particularly, as well as various industry groups that support my research program and the research that I described here today. And yeah, thank you once again, and hope that we can answer some questions yet if time allows.
Absolutely. So a couple of reminders, if you're interested in continuing education credits, the quiz will pop up here at the conclusion of the program and you can take the quiz. You have to remember to hit select submit to have those credits count for you to get your continuing education credits. Couple of questions as you remind us, those three big areas, the health of the cow, um, what would be two other things that you have seen health of the cow other than on the side of feet that have had an impact?
Yeah, well, I think um, probably the two biggest ones would be one is which affects all cows, but again, early lactation can be kind of the significant risk period would be the udder health of the cows. So mastitis, both in its clinical and subclinical form. Interesting, we know that, and again, it gets a little bit hard to tease out, but a cow with, especially with clinical mastitis, we know that there's pain associated with that. And again, she's going to probably in a robot scenario not milk as frequently. Um, there's also going to be a reduction in milk produced, and we've actually have some data from early lactation cows where we see these cows actually change their milking behavior anywhere from a week to 10 days before we actually diagnose a clinical mastitis event in those cows. And so the cows are already showing changes in their voluntary milking at the robot before we see them really the clinical signs of that disease. And so some of that could be already pain. It could just be, yeah, changes in the physiology of the cows where she might start already, right? If there's a latent infection there or there's a subclinical infection there that's maybe causing some more somatic cell count or a white blood cell response, and we see somatic cell counts rise. We see a little bit of a reduction in production of those cows that might actually influence the milking behavior of those cows. And so that's a big one. And then the other one is actually the energy balance of those cows, particularly again, early lactation cows. Um, we have other data to suggest that we sometimes see higher levels of fat mobilization in robot herds and ketosis. Not clinical ketosis per se, but subclinical levels of BHB. And it's not just necessarily cows that are mobilizing a lot of fat because they're higher producing, because we do see that in some herds. In this case, or at least some of our data would suggest that some of these herds, these robot herds that are mobilizing more fat, are not necessarily our higher producing herds. So there's likely other risk factors at play there. And what I was trying to get at is that, yeah, these cows are making less milk, and part of that is related to the milking behavior. We see changes in voluntary milking on these cows, and it could also be tied in with the feeding response that I talked about before, where again we know a cow that's at higher risk of fat mobilization is a more inappetitive cow, right? A cow that doesn't want to eat as much in early lactation, and so maybe that's also then having an impact on her milking behavior at the same time, and so it's likely that those things are related and impacting those cows.
Awesome. That's awesome insight. Food for thought, you could say.
Mhm.
So if you have additional questions, you can go directly to Dr. DeVries. We have contact information on the final slide, on the question slide here. So anyone who is listening to a recording at a future date can make sure that you can get your further questions by typing in the email that is provided. For those of you who have listened first here on the Dairy Signal, this is your first time, make sure that you consider getting continuing education credits. And we've thanked Dr. DeVries very much, not only for this episode, but for past working with professional dairy producers when it comes to cow behaviors and helping us really hone in and fine tune and get into the minds of these cows so that we can really be thinking about what their needs are. Because we know when we meet the needs of the first client, which is the dairy cow, we can certainly take care of our families, our businesses, and best exceed the needs of our customer, our final customer, our consumer. So on behalf of professional dairy producers, a hearty thank you, Dr. DeVries, and to all of our members out there and listeners, make today your very best. And we're signing out from Professional Dairy Producers. Thank you.